We're still talking about federalism, and now we're looking at something called implied powers, because implied powers of the federal government are different than the enumerated powers. And implied powers are going to lead to the federal government gaining more and more power over economics, social policy, um, than it ever maybe was intended in the original Constitution. Originally in the Constitution, the states still had a lot of power, and frankly, most people almost never dealt with the federal government. For the first 100+ years of our country's history, the only time you ever dealt with any aspects of the federal government might have been with the post office. That'd be about it. The post office creating either a road or delivering you mail. Other than that, you had no dealings with the federal government. And so that's very different. Why did that change? Well, part of it was the Civil War, of course, but a part of it was in this interpretation of the Constitution with what's called implied power. So 1.37, let's go through it, flip over, backside. All right, so implied powers are powers not explicitly named or enumerated or expressed or delegated in the Constitution. Okay, so these are the ones that they're not necessarily named right there. They're not obvious, like the right to declare war or to regulate the military or whatnot. So these are not explicitly named. They are assumed to exist. They are assumed to exist. Why? Why are they assumed to exist? Why are these powers, implied powers, assumed to exist? Well, they're necessary to implement the expressed powers named in Article 1. So Congress in Article 1, Section 8, has a list of all these powers. And it's necessary to implement those expressed powers by having these implied powers. That's the debate in terms of like what is a power that's needed in order to carry out an expressed power. Let's look at this. All right. Here's an implied power. The expressed, start at the left-hand side of this chart. The expressed power is to borrow money. Okay, Congress has the right to borrow money. Like that's written in Article 1, Section 8. It's very clearly expressed. The implied power is they have a right to establish a Federal Reserve System of banks. So like, well, we can't borrow money unless we have a Federal Reserve. So therefore, we need to create a Federal Reserve of banks, like basically a national bank. That was a big debate early in the Republic. Jackson got rid of it. So that's that. Expressed to lay and collect taxes. All right, what's the implied power? To punish tax evaders, to regulate the sale of some commodity such as alcohol, and they actually have an excise tax on alcohol at the federal level. Outlaw the use of other types of products like narcotics. Require the states to meet a condition for federal funding. So all these different things. Raise an army. That means they have an implied power to draft people. Regulate commerce means an implied power to establish a minimum wage or to ban discrimination. By the way, that's very more recent, since really the New Deal and the Great Depression, some of those powers. So the point is that there's the express power and then there's the implied aspects. And it's how far does the implied power go? Generally, in the last 100 years, this has increased. Like the power of the government has increased based on interpretation by Congress and especially the Supreme Court. All right. Now let's look at two parts of the Constitution that have been used by Congress and by the Supreme Court to extend the power of the federal government and make it more powerful and have more power to create law on issues that maybe historically it didn't really have the power. In number 1.38 is the necessary and proper clause. Necessary and proper is in quotes because that's actually from the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that lists all the powers of Congress. All right, so Article 1, Section 8 is where the necessary and proper clause is found. It's also known as the elastic clause because Congress has stretched its meaning in order to gain power over areas that are not necessarily enumerated. All right, so it's called the elastic clause. It's stretchy. All right, and here's kind of what it says. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out this power. All right. So whatever the power is, make war. Congress has the power to make laws which shall be necessary and proper. So they can pass regulations for uniforms. They can pass all kinds of rules about what life is going to be like if you're in the army, and they have. Okay. They can buy ships. They can buy military equipment. They can have, pay people to develop new weapons. All of these things are implied powers. So here's what it says: for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So that is actually what the necessary and proper clause says. It says that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So that's why Congress is going to say, well, in order to do X, this enumerated power, we have to have the power to do Y, and that's the debate. Sometimes the Supreme Court has overruled Congress and says, nope, that's not you going outside the bounds of the Constitution. And then other times they've agreed with Congress and allowed Congress to do whatever action it is. So this has been used, the necessary and proper clause has been used to justify more federal power, and that's changed the balance between power between the states and the federal government. Used to justify more federal power. Pause if you need to. All right, last one of this lesson is 1.39, and this is the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is probably even more than necessary and proper clause, it's probably the clause that's been used the most to expand the power of commerce. The power of Congress, the power of Congress. Congress has gained a lot of power at the federal level because it can always, it's been justifying laws based on the regulating of interstate commerce. So the Commerce Clause has been used dramatically for that. All right, Article 1, Section 8. You don't have to write the things below that. Just put the bullet points, please. But let me just say what it is, okay? So it says Congress has the power to, quote, regulate the commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. So regulating commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, nobody debates that Congress has the right, in only exclusive right, to regulate commerce with foreign nations. How much power does it have to regulate among the several states? That's where the debate has been. That's where the debate has been, both at the Supreme Court and in Congress. This is an enumerated power. The regulate commerce is an enumerated power, but how far does that extend? And it means they can regulate trade between states, like literally things crossing the borders. But then the question is, does Congress have the right to regulate things that don't cross borders, but like it was made from products that cross borders? That's something where 100 years ago, no, now yes. And what this has been used to justify is basically Congress has the right to regulate almost any economic activity in the country. Basically anything, even if it only happens within a state. Congress has used the Commerce Clause to regulate almost any economic activity. And it has been helped by the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, since the New Deal in the 1930s, has been quite supportive of Congress saying, we need this power to carry out the Commerce Clause. And sometimes it's even been a little bit silly, as we'll see in a Supreme Court case that we're going to be studying. So, all right, that is the Commerce Clause. Oh, let me just tell you one interpretation here. James Madison actually was said in 1829, not long before his death, that the Commerce Clause was intended as a negative and preventive provision in order to keep injustice among the states themselves. So really kind of keeping the states from hurting each other. He said, rather than it being used for positive purposes of the general government. So Madison's interpretation of this clause was that it was supposed to just be strictly regulating trade between states and making sure states weren't like tariffing each other and stuff. But now it's been used for positive purposes, meaning that it's justifying minimum wage laws or whatever, all these things that you could justify as positive. And so that was Madison's interpretation of the clause. Very different than today. The last thing is to share with you this idea of federalism. Last thing is this idea of laboratories and democracies, that states may see, if the federal government gains power and we all kind of do the same things, we could lose something that Justice Brandeis said in the Supreme Court. And he said that a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. So the one advantage of federalism is the idea that each state could to do some sort of policy, see how it goes. If it's a disaster, no one else adopts it. But if it's good, then the other states will adopt it. And that's the advantage of federalism. And certainly you could argue that as the federal government gains more and more power over economic and cultural issues, then therefore there is less of those experiments And instead of doing things on one state level, we're starting to do certain experiments maybe on the entire country for good or bad. All right, great, thanks.